Hoping that this would be the case, Hanami climbed off him and sat calmly from the awkward situation. Kazuro, sighing with relief and the end of the beating, began to rise to sit down and begin the game. That same day, screams were heard in the office of the head of the monster absorbers, and the sunny day was broken by bad news. After hearing the bad news, the head of the scavengers was very angry, disappointed in the weakness of his charges, that they could not cope with two people. The head of the Maochi Supreme Devourers University, Wang Lin, came with a report on the failed mission to capture the two fugitives. The head, out of anger, threw the ashtray lying on the table into the wall where Director Lin was standing. With great disappointment, he screamed in anger and did not understand how the 9 masters of the absorbers could not kill the two fugitives. Director Lin was very worried and barely dodged a flying ashtray, which broke into small pieces on the wall. Having calmed down, the head of the absorbers leaned on the table and began to talk out loud about how to correct the mistake of the incompetent Director Lin. To which the director said that apparently they underestimated the enemy, and in vain the head rushes at the director. The report said that 9 heads were found in the cornfield. There were no bodies nearby, so it took them a long time to find the missing agents. Most likely, after the murder, these 2 refugees fled to another city. So far, the whereabouts of the fugitives have not been revealed. Realizing that the enemy is very cunning and selenium, the head proposes to expand the search and hire bounty hunters. Give a reward worthy so that everyone will look for them. During the decision-making process, Director Lin's secretary knocks and enters the office. Before she could say a word, the director attacked her, shouting that he was busy and she was out of time now. Very frightened, she apologized and said that Director Lin's son was severely injured in the battle in the market arena. Fen lost a lot of blood and 2 of his monsters. Director Lin and the head of the absorbers were shocked by what they heard. Fen was a very capable and strong absorber. He could become a strong absorber and chairman of the board. The father, having learned that his son had been severely beaten and had lost a lot of strength, grew worried and stood with a gloomy and nervous face. This news greatly crippled him. His son, the heir of the family, is now weaker than his sister. And what will happen now? The head of the absorbers, after hearing the tragedy of Director Lin, looked at the joint photo with his daughter. He was proud of his creation, giving it incredible strength. He looked at the photo and was sure that this would not have happened to his daughter. She was too strong for any opponent, thanks to that monster doll that he took from the girl a couple of years ago. Having played enough of her favorite game, Hanami remembered that she needed to visit her mother and decided to say goodbye to Kajuro. She said they had a good time, and he should go. Having shown where the exit to Rusha was located, she flew on her monster. Kajuro looked at Hanami flying into the sky. Hair fluttered in the wind. She was happy to spend time with a person who understood her. A beautiful starry sky, passing clouds, and Hanami flying on her monster. Kazuro will remember such a sight for a long time. He had a good time with her, and he will look forward to meeting her soon. All the time spent together caused a storm of emotions. Kajuro's eyes sparkled with happiness. He went home in a good mood under the bright sky. In a couple of days, the holidays end and I have to go to university. Having collected his things, Kazuro waited for the bus to Fu Fel University. Going inside, he saw the fat man Po, who waved to him and invited him to sit next to him. The road was long, since the university was located outside the city. Towards evening, when it began to get dark, Po notices that there is a cemetery around and they will soon leave. The horror of not knowing what kind of university Kazuro advised him began to show on his face. Kazuro began to reassure Po, claiming that these were probably training locations. The gloomy atmosphere was a good reason to prepare for battle. Po, gathering his courage, agreed that such a place really looked like a training ground. He had never seen anything like this anywhere. Apparently Fu Fel University is very cool, Po said. Having got off the bus, he drove as quickly as possible, and our guys stood near the cemetery alone and in the dark. Realizing that the place is quite creepy and the first acquaintance with the area was not pleasant. There were only coffins around and a dense fog, rolling shivers through the body. The guys stood and did not move. They did not yet realize where to go. A suddenly rising wind knocked an ornament from a nearby grave straight onto Po's head. He screamed loudly out of fear and began to think that a monster had done it. While Po was terrified of the place, Kojuro tried to remain calm and, going into his phone, wanted to look at the map where they should go. There was no network here, and the guys decided to look for a road. Maybe it would lead them to the university. Having found a path between the graves, they followed it. Kojuro was also calm and tried to maintain his composure. But on the contrary, he kept turning it from side to side and was frightened by every rustle. Hearing another suspicious creaking, he noticed a huge crypt. His eyes immediately began to water with fear. Horror rolled over his face. Seeing what was inside, Po became very frightened and jumped away. Kojuro was surprised and looked into the coffin. In the middle of the cemetery, it was scary, but there was an open grave. This was already suspicious. A vampire slept inside. His green glow was very strong, and his robe said that he was more than 200 years old. This was clearly not a weak monster, thought Kojuro. He looked at the monster, who was still sleeping, and really did not want to meet in a duel with such a thing. But behind him he could already hear the sounds of heavy steps and breathing. These were zombies. They approached the guys slowly, but with a great desire to devour them. Kojuro saw several dozen zombies, and knowing that they were weak, was not particularly worried. When he saw the zombie, he tried to hide behind a suitcase, crying and shouting for help. He was confused and didn't know what to do. He was weak and cowardly, and had never seen such monsters. Showing determination to act, Kojuro decided to call on monsters for help and fight the damned souls of the dead. He also reminded Po that he too must have a monster to fight. The time was right to use it. Having collected himself, the fat man began to call upon his monster for protection. After using the summoning spell, the silhouette of a huge monster began to appear from his mana. It was the ghost of a smelly garbage container. The smell wafting from him could wake anyone up. Smelling the stench of the tank, the ghoul in a monk's robe opened his eyes. The fierce look from the unwanted awakening wanted to punish the culprit, and the whole glow in the grave only intensified. Po notices that zombies are starting to surround them and decides to climb inside his monster and wait it out. Kojuro, noticing that Po was scared again, understands that he will have to fight alone. Po suggests that he too can climb inside and wait out the attack. Suddenly, a hand comes out of the ground and quickly tries to grab the fat man while he is trying to climb into his monster. While trying to get inside the monster, Po feels something holding his leg and begins to scream and cry loudly out of fear. Having fallen to the ground, he begins to be pulled under, and the tank monster is unable to help with its short arms. Po starts screaming, thinking that he is going to die. Kojuro saw this and asks the monster with a chainsaw to pull him out of the ground. Approaching Po, the monster with a chainsaw grabs the boy by the head and pulls him out. In mute silence, they look at each other, and the monster with the chainsaw awakens a thirst for hunger. He looks at Po as if he were a tasty piece of fresh human flesh and licks his lips. Saliva runs down his face, and his eyes glow with the desire to devour the boy. Kojuro shouts at him to let the guy go and not dare to eat him. He is a friend. The monster with the chainsaw reluctantly lets go of the boy, but when he falls to the ground, Po feels like a couple of small monsters have grabbed his legs and want to bite him. The monster manages to cut off the insatiable zombies with his saw. Po, in horror and fear, no longer knows where to go to escape. He had never experienced such a prolonged nightmare. After death, stones also fall out of zombies, this time small and yellow. They have little strength, but enough to enhance skills. Po notices them, but fear does not allow him to take the stones. A vampire in a sacred robe decides to join the battle, calling his servants to fight. He enhances the effect of the fog and casts a control spell. Such power is capable of controlling others. Kojuro considers this ability to be very promising, and he would like to possess it. Unexpectedly for Kojuro, the vampire begins to attack at high speed, flying towards the guy. His eyes sparkled like neon, and the sharp claws just wanted to dig into the guy's face. Barely having time to dodge the sharp claws, Kojuro shouts to the busty monster to use a binding spell. Taking out her zither, she begins to play a paralyzing melody and tries to drive the vampire into terror. Kojuro notices that she didn't wear the guy's gift and apparently doesn't trust him yet. even after past battles. This makes him a little sad. Having succumbed to the magic of hypnosis of a busty monster, the vampire freezes and cannot do anything. His power is stronger than Kazuro's monsters, so there is no time to hesitate. Kazuro shouts at the monster with the chainsaw to attack the vampire, and quickly. Having already acted according to the well-established scheme of stun plus attack, Kazuro was sure that there would be at least some damage, and whether it would force the vampire to retreat or surrender would be seen later. The monster with the chainsaw, having finished killing the zombies, turns around to attack the vampire. Loudly accelerating his chainsaw, he rushes into the attack. With a strong blow at full speed, the monster with a chainsaw kicks the vampire off his leg, throwing him back tens of meters. Then he starts running at him to cut him. Poe, having opened the lid of the tank, began to shout to Kajuro to get into his tank. There were more monsters, and his monsters could handle it themselves. Kazuro, hearing Poe's words, doubts a little, but realizes that it will be safer this way because he won't do anything to the monsters anyway. Garbage Can apparently does not have offensive skills, but he does have damage blocking and defense skills. The choice may not be the best, but the guys have no other choice. Jumping into the tank, Kazuro watches the progress of the battle and hopes that the monster with a chainsaw and the busty beauty will cope. Although the figure of the busty monster influenced the vampire, he was still able to defend himself and stopped the chainsaw flying at his face with his bare hands. Such a monster was clearly stronger and could, albeit weakly, counter the attacks of a monster with a chainsaw. Chainsaw tried his best to cut the vampire. They looked at each other with angry looks, but the vampire was stronger, and this slightly tensed the monster with the chainsaw. Uncertainty about his victory flashed a little in his eyes. While the saw was fighting with the vampire and the busty beauty was trying to restrain him with her waist charms, Kazuro notices an unpleasant sight. A crowd of zombies began running towards the trash can with the desire to devour them. The trash can monster's legs began to give way. He was no longer entirely sure that he could withstand so many attacks. The dead souls clung to the container and began to try to gnaw and break through. The evil and hungry look of the thoughtless creatures forced them to act as aggressively as possible without sparing themselves. Without withstanding a large number of attacks, the container's strength begins to weaken. At some point, the zombies were able to punch the wall of the tank with their fist, thereby scaring the guys. The fat man began to tremble with fear. His eyes looked like an endless stream of tears. He prayed to all the gods to survive and escape from this nightmare. The lid of the tank began to open slightly. Kazuro was ready to somehow fight off the zombies just to survive. Our hero's tense face and aggressive gaze showed determination. The head of a zombie appeared in the crack of the slightly open lid, screaming from hunger and a desire to taste the internal organs of the children. At that very second, something very fast takes off half the zombie's head. Not understanding what happened, the guys looked silently in bewilderment. The zombies notice that their comrade has been killed and begin to look around. The trash can monster, standing in fear, notices a creature in the sky, rapidly flying towards it. The flying monster cuts off the heads of the remaining zombies at great speed, thereby helping the stinking tank. Having deprived the vampire of his servants, it was now possible to attack him. A vampire, in the heat of battle with a monster with a chainsaw, notices that a new enemy has appeared and destroyed his servants. Throwing away the monster with the chainsaw, he tries to attack the attackers. Making the most terrifying face possible, the vampire jumped up to strike from the air and finish off the monster standing motionless in front of him. A girl's voice from the side, appearing out of nowhere, began ordering another monster to attack the vampire. The vampire realizes that it was a trap, but it was already too late. Behind him stood a huge monster, already raising his hand to strike. Fear ran across his face and past memories from life. The vampire fell. Next to him stood a monster without a head, and with a face on its torso, which dealt a powerful blow. This did not kill the vampire, but knocked him out for a long time. Opening the lid of the garbage can monster, Kajuro sees a girl standing in front of him and looks around in surprise. A friendly and rather pretty girl introduces herself as Sarah, and declares that she is a senior student at Fufel University. She has come to take the guys to their dormitory. Kajuro was very happy, but said that she was a little late. Another couple of minutes, and there would be no trace left of them. Smiling, she said that she just wanted to see what they were capable of and watched from the sidelines. Having clarified that Kajuro held up quite well and skillfully controlled his monsters, Kazuro thanked Sarah for his kind words and added that his monsters are capable of more. I just don't quite trust him yet. The busty beauty and the monster with the chainsaw standing behind appreciated the guy's words and smiled slightly, calling them back to let them rest and gain strength. Kajuro decides to ask about what happened. What kind of place is this, and why are there so many monsters here? Sarah replies that they took the most dangerous route possible, through the undergrad proving grounds. Only strong monsters live here, and they came across a vampire capable of summoning zombies. Kazuro was a little surprised by what he heard and was glad that everything ended well. Finally, Po came to his senses and opened it to see where Kazuro had gone. He was scared and afraid to climb out of the garbage can monster. Seeing that there were no monsters around, and Kajuro was standing in some company, Po felt better. Kajuro told Po that they were safe, and that upperclassman Sarah had come to take them to the dorm. When he heard that a girl had come for them, he began to climb out of the tank. Seeing what a beautiful girl came to meet them, he immediately tried to make a good impression and act as charming and confident as possible. Running up to them, Po immediately extended his hand to meet the senior student. Seeing up close that she was even more beautiful, he began to show off his advantages and say all sorts of untrue things in order to impress the girl. Telling how he bravely fought a horde of monsters and trying to save Kajuro, he hid him in a trash can. After a long battle, exhausted, he climbed into the tank and tried to rest, and then she came to the rescue. Po stated in an affirmative voice. Kajuro, smiling at Po's words, began to hint that she had been nearby all the time and had seen the fight, how Po was crying and screaming for help all the time. Hearing this, Po immediately grabbed Kajuro's face and said, "Why didn't he say it right away?" At the same time, blushing deeply with shame. Laughing, Kazuro said that everything is normal, and there is no need to worry so much. Fear of such monsters is normal. Sarah also started laughing at Po's awkward situation. The laughter was pure and non-judgmental. After a couple more compliments from Po and an apology for what happened, the guys began to pack up and hit the road. Having summoned her monsters, Sarah did not finish off the vampire. She knew that this was a training ground, and the guys would train here just like her. But she didn't want to kill a high-ranking monster and deprive others of training. After summoning her monsters, Sarah looked at the guys. At that moment, Kazuro noticed that the vampire began to rise and tensed a little. He saw the vampire start to run away screaming. Kazuro was surprised, to which Sarah told him that this was not the first time she had knocked him out, and he remembered her. Sarah clarified that she just trains a lot on this site, and all the monsters already know her, so they run away knowing that they cannot win. At the same time, he winked at Kazuro, realizing how strong she was, that she was able to bring such a vampire to the highest level. I began to feel a little awkward. Then she added that over time, they too would be able to terrify the local monsters by training hard. Kajuro looked at her, seeing a worthy monster slayer, and wanted to learn more about her techniques and monsters. The guys looked pretty tired, and they wanted to eat delicious food and go to bed. Remembering how many monsters they saw today and barely survived, they needed a rest. Kajuro notices the green stones and asks Sarah if they can take them, or is it the property of Fufel University? Smiling sincerely, she says that it is theirs by right, as it is a reward for killing monsters, so they can earn stones for themselves. Overjoyed, the guys began to collect stones, already imagining how much money they would get for them on the black market. This is quite a profitable business. By training to earn stones, and then exchange them for money. Kajuro liked this. Seeing that it was already late, Sarah pointed to the path where to go. They had to hurry, otherwise the guys would be left without dinner. Grabbing their suitcases, their stomachs growling, they looked at the girl as if in slow motion. Her skirt fluttered in the wind, revealing her long and smooth legs. She was calm and joyful, and her gait was as if she was dancing. The guys were a little surprised by such calmness, especially being in the middle of a cemetery. It looked strange. Finally, the guys reached the entrance to the campus. The view was a little scary. There were cobwebs everywhere and no lights. It felt like it was just another training center. Kajuro raised his head and saw the university sign, Fufel, and smiled. Finally, he has entered and will be able to study and upgrade his abilities as a monster absorber. Walking into the campus, the guys saw a crowd of guys who also came for admission. The guys were surprised that Kazuro and Po were accompanied by an older student. One of the guys shouted indignantly, "Why are these guys accompanied by such a beauty?" But no one accompanied them, but were met only at the entrance to the town. Having received a slap on the head from the person greeting him, the boy almost fell. The greeter, holding the list of students for admission, was very unhappy with such indignation and decided to explain. Pointing his finger at Kajuro, the greeter said that this is the strongest of the applicants and is capable of fighting on equal terms with many experienced absorbers. The boy is just one of the weakest and was surprised by the presence of the strongest in such a weak university. Kajuro stood in the middle of the crowd, a little shy. Everyone around looked at him and admired such a classmate. Some wondered why he entered the least popular university. It was already quite dark outside. The atmosphere was gloomy, crows were flying around, and the fog was thickening. Some had already checked into the dorm, while the rest were still waiting to receive the key to the room. Senior student Sarah approached Kajuro and handed him the keys to the room. The guys stood in front of the dorm and acted a little embarrassed. As she prepares to leave, she remembers to give instructions to the boys before going to bed. Firstly, you need to close the doors to the room. Monsters walk here at night and can attack. She especially looked at Fat Po so that he would not forget her words. Po was very happy that Sarah turned to him. He fell in love with this beauty. He was happy that she was so nice to him that he thought she liked him too. Kazuro watched Po fly in the clouds and wanted to bring him down to the ground, saying that he was too cowardly and inexperienced, that she did not want Po to die in the first days from a monster in his sleep. Po was greatly hurt by this, and he began to object, waving his arms that he was not a coward and was able to cope with the enemy. Walking into the dorm, they went up to their floor and began looking for a room. Approaching the desired door, they heard strange sounds coming from the room. Po was a little scared and asked Kajuro to check. Kajuro, without showing any concern, opens the door to the room. The lights in it were turned off, but the sounds of grinding metal could be heard very clearly. Fearing what was there, I decided to take a look too. Opposite the balcony, a guy was sitting on the floor sharpening his sword on a whetstone. It was dark around, but this did not bother the unknown guy. The guys looked at the guy sharpening his maple a little with a sharp edge. Po was afraid that it was a murderer or some kind of maniac. Kazuro, having calmed his feelings, decided to talk to the guy. "Turn on the light." He turned to the guy. "Why is he sitting in the dark? This environment is quite creepy and can scare your roommates." Kajuro looked at Po and said that he would take the top bunk. Po stood at the entrance and was a little afraid. His uncertainty was a weakness that greatly exposed him to his opponents. Climbing up onto his bed, Kajuro began to cover it. While Po was fiddling with his suitcase and looking for something to eat before going to bed, the guy with the blade continued to sharpen it and did not pay attention to the guys. Kazuro decided that it would be okay for him to get to know his roommate. He sat on the floor working with his blade, silent and focused on his work. His behavior was a little suspicious, but they will have to study and live together, so they have to come up with something. Paying closer attention to the sword, Kazuro drew attention to the unusualness of the blade and why a monster absorber would need such a sword if he had the abilities of monsters. He did not understand. The red voice turned to Kazuro with the words that this is not an ordinary sword. People used to be executed like this for disobedience to the shogun in ancient times. Apparently, this is a family heirloom, and the guy inherited it. Kajuro decided to ask his roommate directly what kind of blade he had, and why would a monster absorber need such a weapon. Testing the sharpness of the blade without taking his eyes off the maple, he replies that it is his family's heirloom, passed down as an inheritance for passing the tests. The red voice showed his concern by telling Kajuro that this is a very dangerous guy. Apparently, he has strong fighting skills and is capable of destroying any enemy without being absorbed by the monster. Red-Eye recalled that once, when he was a man, he was killed by a man with the same sword. It really frightened my eyes looking at the boy. Kazuro thought, apparently the Red-Eye is already many years old. If he remembers the ancient events of Japan, maybe he will improve his knowledge of history if asked, Kazuro thought. The boy with the blade decided to introduce himself as Han Goku. He entered Fufel because he was offered a very low price for studying, and here he is. Kazuro was glad that they finally started a conversation. To celebrate, he jumped out of bed to find out more about Khan. Kazuro wanted to know why he uses the sword and what tests he went through to receive such an inheritance. Khan began to tell that there were not many people in their village, and nearby there was a mountain on which very strong monsters lived. Every year, when a guy or girl with the power of absorption wanted to achieve more in life, they had to go to the mountain and fight monsters. If you defeat the monster and can absorb it, then you deserve to achieve more and leave the village. Each of those who come after the test receives a family weapon from the family and leaves. Kazuro decided to ask, what happens to those who were unable to absorb the monster? To which Khan replied that no one else saw them. It's a one-way path. Either you win or you die. The guys looked at Khan with surprise and realized that he was very strong and it was better not to quarrel with him. After his story, Khan asked the guys how they got here. Kazuro replied that the director of Fufel, Mr. Sota, came to his home and offered to enter his university for free. Since he had no other choice, he agreed, and Po did with him according to Kazuro's wishes. Po listened to the boys' conversation in silence and did not interrupt. Khan was a little surprised at Director Sota's generosity in taking someone for free. Kazuro began to tell stories about how he fought with a boy from the Mao Chi Supreme Devourers School and won. He was even shown on TV. After long conversations and funny stories, the guys were very tired and planned to get ready for bed. Outside, the fog had already cleared and the moon was visible against the background of the starry sky. After long conversations, Po felt the urge to go to the toilet, and he asked Khan where he could relieve himself. Showing the guys where the toilet was, Po tensed up a little, because there's a lot of chemicals to pour in and clean up. The picture was unpleasant. Night came, and the only thing you could hear along the corridor was the snoring of students from their rooms. Moonlight comes in through the windows and illuminates the room. The slightly open door to the room made it clear that the guys did not understand Sarah's words well, and did not lock the door. The guys slept and didn't hear anything. A sweet dream after a difficult day was very welcome. Kazuro snored and did not pay attention to suspicious sounds. Suddenly the sounds became very suspicious, and were coming from Po's bed. Kazuro tensed up greatly and saw the door ajar. Remembering Sarah's words about monsters, he decided to check. Moving quietly to the edge of the bed, he lowered his head to see what the noise was on Po's bed. From what he saw, the boy was very tense and understood that he had to act quickly. They wrapped some strange threads around him and began to choke him. Po was very frightened and tried to free himself, but the threads squeezed his throat, not allowing him to even call for help. My face was already starting to turn blue. I had to do something. Kazuro quickly starts jumping off the bed to help. Po was already beginning to kick his legs from the lack of air. His eyes were bulging. Landing on the floor, Kazuro notices how a sharp and shiny blade flies near his head at high speed. He cuts very easily the threads from the door crack that grabbed Po. Kazuro turns on the light in the room. Po tries to catch his breath and thanks the guys for their help. Khan points out that among the monsters roaming the corridors, there are no ones who can control the threads. Barely breathing, trying to catch his breath, he remembers that Sarah said to lock the door before going to bed. He won't make such a mistake again. Kazuro looked at him with relief. Kazuro decided to praise Po for being able to hold his breath for so long, trying to lift his spirits and dispel the tense situation. Po was perplexed, because these threads could kill him. Could something like this really happen here? Po spoke in surprise. Po looked at his trembling hands, on which particles of thread remained. He suggested that these are not simple threads. They are similar to the puppeteer's threads. He saw these on the internet on an underground fighting website. Kazuro took the thread and began to examine it. Apparently, this is the work of senior students. They wanted to teach the new students a lesson, but with these methods they could kill. Khan suggested going and checking who these threads belong to. If these scum can harm people, then they need to be taught a lesson. Kazuro was sleepy, but the fear that the attackers might harm the others did not leave him. He agrees with Khan to go and find out who owns this power to control the threads. Leaving the room, Kajuro asked Po to stay here and close the door. When they return, they will say the code word tuna, and Po will open it for them. Leaving the room, Han took his maple, and Kajuro, as always, put his hands in his pockets and observed his surroundings. They walked along the corridor under the rays of the moon, expecting to meet and teach the scoundrel a lesson. Po agreed with the guys and wished them luck. He was scared, and he definitely wouldn't go anywhere, so he happily stayed in the room. Watching the guys disappear into the shadows of the dark corridor, Po closed the door and crawled under the blanket. Meanwhile, a group of senior students stood on the roof of the dormitory, laughing loudly and rejoicing that they had caused a commotion for the newcomers, and now they would lock the doors and not leave after midnight. The guys were happy and laughed. They loved to meet newcomers, putting them in danger, and did not worry since no one suspected them. The guy in the blue jacket with blonde hair turned his attention to his monster, who felt that the threads had been cut and no longer obeyed him. Throwing the cigarette on the floor, he could not believe that someone had managed to get rid of the monster's shackles. Really among those admitted? Are there any absorbers with monsters and experience in battles? Mostly scum and hooligans enroll in this university. There are only a few normal people here. Unexpectedly for the guys, a door on the roof opened, and two guys came out heading towards them. The company was angry with the insolent people and demanded that they get out of here. Kazuro and Han, going out onto the roof, decided to ask if it was their monster that attacked the first-year students. Such actions could lead to the death of one student, and they did not like such a warm welcome. So Kajuro asked, "Who is the owner of the puppeteer monster?" The company was irritated by such impudence. Will some freshman tell them what to do? "Do you want to die?" the group said. The guy in the blue jacket said that he is the owner of the monster puppeteer, and that is the last thing they will know. Angry at the impudence of the two first years, he orders his comrades to attack and teach the scum a lesson. Having activated their abilities, the bunch of hooligans were ready to see fear and tears in the brats. Showing their abilities by summoning a blue monster and a fiery hand, they are ready to teach a lesson. Kajuro, seeing the monsters summoned by the bullies and the half-monster with the fire hand ability, laughed at their weak skills. Having heard humiliation from the freshmen, they were sure that he didn't even have such, and he was showing off in vain in front of them. Kazuro picked his ear, not attaching importance to the words of the hooligans. He decided to troll them with words that it was already late and they should go to bed. Otherwise, the children would not get enough sleep and would not be attentive in class. This only infuriated the hooligans more, and they decided not to spare Kazuro and Han. "Accidents happen everywhere, and on the roof of the hostel is no exception," said the guy in the blue jacket. Kazuro's caustic jokes even smiled and thought that the boy was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. "The monsters began to attack our guys. They fled with the desire to kill the small parasites." The chief and his comrades stood behind and looked at the lesson to the insolent people. Fen suggested splitting up and taking on the blue monster, while Kajuro would take on the guy with the monster's arm. Having agreed, the guys began to act. Kazuro, realizing that this was a man, did not want to kill him. Han's very fast speed surprised Kazuro. He knew that he skillfully wielded a sword, but he had no idea that his abilities were so enormous. Standing in surprise, Kazuro doesn't even have time to notice anything. The blue monster's head was cut off. The speed of the blade and Khan were elusive to the eye. Nobody expected this. The owner of the monster coughed up blood and felt sick, all because of a side effect of the absorbed monster. The girls behind were surprised and did not understand what had happened. The guy with the monster's hand was already approaching Kajuro and, stretching his hand to a huge size, swung to hit the guy. Activating his red voice, Kazuro puts the guy into hypnosis and makes him fall asleep. Feeling a trembling in his body and a state of sleepiness, the guy tries to fight the hypnosis and resist, but the power of the red eye is too strong. Having fallen exhausted and drooling from deep sleep, the boy began to snore heavily. Kazuro stood and looked at the stupid attacks. realizing that he and Kazuro could not cope. The guy in the blue jacket, realizing that the enemy was not stupid and had experience in battles, became a little worried. The girls sitting on their knees behind him were trembling violently for fear that they might be punished. He started shouting to Kajuro and Han that how dare they attack the senior students. They wouldn't get away with it so easily. They don't even know what they've gotten themselves into. Listening to the pathetic threats of the guy in the blue jacket, Kazuro and Fen stood in bewilderment. They didn't care about punishment. They just wanted to teach the senior students a lesson for mocking the weak. Having interrupted the guy in the blue jacket, Kazuro decided to continue the fight and tell him to talk less and engage in battle. Otherwise, it's somehow boring with them. Kajuro hasn't seen such weaklings who think they're tough for a long time. The girls, out of fear, grabbed the legs of the guy in the blue jacket and began to ask him to help and save them. The tears in their eyes and the fear that they would tell the director everything and they would be expelled was very strong. He lifted them from his knees, grabbed them by the shoulders, and pulled them closer to him. He whispered that he would deal with the scum. It was clear in his gaze that he was planning something. Hugging the girls, the guy in the blue jacket looked at his monster puppeteer with one eye and came up with a way to win. He forced the monster to wrap control threads around his girlfriends. They screamed in pain and the realization that their body was beyond their control. This was a very dirty act by their leader of the student group. He became like a puppeteer and could control the girls. Such actions are very dangerous, and the guy's psyche is clearly disturbed. Realizing this, Kajuro began to come up with a plan to free the girls and a way to capture the guy in the blue jacket. The girls began to say that they were in pain. They couldn't control themselves and they wanted to go home. Kazuro thought that Han, with his blade, would be able to cut the threads, as he did with Po, and save the girls. Suddenly, the girls began to attack Kazuro and Han. There was fear on their faces, and they did not want to die. The guy in the blue jacket turned around and began to run away in the opposite direction in order to complicate the task for our heroes. Having managed to dodge the attacks of the girls' uncontrolled movements, Kazuro tried to come up with a plan and wait for the moment. Their movements were very fast and did not quite match their outfits. Khan was also attacked by a girl, although she moved quickly, but with a guy who has the skills of his ancestors, this will not work. She was ashamed and scared to fight with such guys, but she could not resist the skills of the puppeteer. With their backs pressed to each other, the guys stood waiting for the next attack. Kazuro suggested splitting up. Kazuro will take charge of the girls, and Hanu will have to deal with the guy in the blue jacket. The girls begged to be saved. They were in pain, but they could not control their bodies. Kazuro decided to summon a chainsaw monster and deal with the problem. The monster with the chainsaw wanted to cut and devour the girls' flesh, but Kazuro forbade him to attack the girls. They only had to cut the threads. Chainsaw didn't like it, but he did it. Having fallen from the release of their bonds, the girls were very frightened by the monster with a chainsaw. He looked at them with a hungry look, but Kazuro forbade them to eat. The guy in the blue jacket was very scared that now they could deal with him too. The path to the stairs was blocked, and they will be able to catch up with him with such and such skills. An emergency decision had to be made. Having wrapped his body in the monster's threads, the guy in the blue jacket decided to jump off the roof. Finally, he told the guys that he would take revenge on them later. Jumping from the roof, the guy in the blue jacket only laughed in response as he descended. His monster controlled the flow of the thread and watched its master's descent. Han and Kazuro try not to let go of the guy in the blue jacket and try to cut the threads in time. Khan jumps up to enhance the effect and cuts the threads. The blade is very sharp and cuts everything that comes under it without any difficulty. Before he can get down, the guy in the blue jacket falls from a height and breaks his leg. Screams of pain come from him. Raising his head, the guy in the blue jacket was very weak from his wounds and tried to climb out of the dorm with his own hands and call an ambulance. Kazuro and Han looked at the humiliation of the guy in the blue jacket and thought that if they finished him off, it would not be entirely humane. Such a bastard could return in a couple of weeks and catch him in surprise and attack. Noticing that the monster of the guy in the blue jacket is still standing on the roof, Kazuro decides to teach the guy a lesson and kill his monster, simultaneously ordering the monster with a chainsaw to deal with the puppeteer. Mercilessly, the chainsaw monster cuts off the puppeteer's head with its razor-sharp saw chain. From killing an absorbed monster, the owner suffers severe pain from the loss of the monster. It is believed that this is how a part of the soul dies. If the devourer loses too many of his monsters, he may even die from the pain. While the monster with the chainsaw enjoyed the meat of the killed monster, the girls were afraid of fear, looking at such a terrible sight. Kazuro approached the monster with a saw and began stroking it on the head, telling the girls that they should not worry, no one would eat them. Leaving the roof after an easy victory and solving problems, the guys approached their room. Khan opened the doors and was a little scared. Kazuro looked at him and began to suspect something was wrong. He was afraid for Po and ran to the door. Seeing a huge trash can in the middle of the room, Kazuro calmed down and told the Khan that this was Po's protective monster. There was no need to chew it. Khan thought that this trash had eaten Po, since he had not seen him anywhere. Having opened the container, Kazuro looked at Po, who was sleeping without his hind legs, drooling in the middle of a pile of garbage. Khan was very surprised that someone had swallowed up a trash can monster. He couldn't even wrap his head around how disgusting it was. Apparently, Po is generally fearless if such a stench doesn't scare him. Morning came. The sun's rays made their way through the windows and warmed us. The alarm clock on Kazuro's phone rang, and the guys began to wake up. Waking up from yesterday, Kazuro had a great night's sleep. Now he wanted to quickly start studying abilities and ways to improve them. After wiping, he saw Khan sitting in front of him on the next bed, holding a magical yellow stone. It felt like he was in a trance and meditating like a monk, Kazuro thought. Khan sat motionless and held the stone. His shadow on the wall looked like a burning fire. Apparently, this is how he fueled his powers with the help of the stone, Kazuro thought. During the morning formation, they were lined up as if in an army. After welcoming the new students, the teacher sent everyone out for a run around the university. After jogging, stopping under a tree, the guys looked for water and decided to ask Kazuro. They were thirsty from the marathon they ran. It was very hard for them. Some didn't even reach the finish line. Kazuro said that he doesn't have water, but he has wet wipes if they want. They can twist out a couple of drops for themselves, Kazuro joked. The guys were a little confused and did not appreciate the guy's joke. Suddenly, a very feminine guy approaches them and hints that they will soon bring him water, and if they agree to do something for him, then he will give them water. Stroking his silky, long hair, he winked at the guys. Kazuro listened to this nonsense and just grinned, leaning against a tree. The guys, a little doubting the normality of the long-haired guy, wanted to ask if he was deceiving them. The long-haired man looked at Kazuro and offered him water in return for the favor, which the boy refused, considering it stupid. There wasn't much left until the end of the lesson to owe someone on the first day at the university. The long-haired man simply offered to make friends and, if necessary, help in a scrape, if such a thing happened. Kazuro looked down on him, not willing to drag himself into friendship with this suspicious guy. His girlfriend appears behind the long-haired man and brings water. She looked quite pretty and happy next to such a feminine guy. Kazuro tried not to pay attention to the vulgar attacks of the long-haired boy in front of them. He licked the neck of the bottle too vigorously and drank the water with great pleasure, trying to piss off the guys and ask for a sip. Po turns his attention to someone very handsome in the distance walking towards them with a bottle of water. Po recognizes her and screams with joy, prompting the others to take a look. It was Sarah, modestly walking with a bottle of water to give to someone. She felt awkward, because too many guys were looking at her and smilingly shouting compliments to her. She walked to Kazuro, embarrassed, and when she saw him, she called him. The surprise of those around was very strong. The person standing next to him was also surprised because he fell in love with Sarah. Kazuro, opening his eyes and hearing that Sarah had approached him, felt a sea of evil glances and hatred on himself. They didn't understand what the senior student saw in him. Embarrassed, Sarah gave a bottle of water to Kazuro with words of gratitude. They stood there, embarrassed by the looks of others. They were shocked that such a beauty gave water to some freshman. Confused, Kazuro took a bottle of water. Not understanding how to act in such situations with girls, he scratched the back of his head and looked at her in surprise. Coming closer, high school student Sarah thanked Kazuro for his help in dealing with the local hooligans and a bottle of water. This is a small thank you from her. Kazuro felt his heart begin to beat faster, and he stood rooted to the spot, not understanding what to do. She asked not to tell anyone about what happened, so as to avoid punishment, and it would remain their secret. Kazuro silently rolled his eyes, agreeing with all her words.